Hi creative kids, I'm Anissa. Our roving reporters Kandice and Sophie met up with two very special film industry guests. First, you'll meet Seph McKenna. Seph works for Roadshow Films, and it's his job to acquire the Australian rights for films that we see in the theatre. So he gets to watch lots of movies, just so he can pick which ones he thinks we'll like. What an amazing job! You'll also get to meet Emma Buckley. She's a writer and director who's worked in the film and theatre industry. Her films have been shown all around the world, and she's won awards. So both of these film industry experts gave us advice on how to write a script, and this is what they said.
So Seph, you've had a lot of experience working with scripts. So what do you think specifically makes a really good script? What do you look for in a script?
First and foremost, Candice, it's about the emotion that the script elicits in you. So in a sense, you are checking yourself in terms of reading a screenplay and thinking, how is this making me feel? Is it, if it's a thriller, is my pulse racing? If it's a horror film, am I scared? If it's a romance, do I want these two people to be together? A perfectly physically formatted screenplay is something that's between 90 and 110 pages long, because we think in the movie industry about 1 page of screenplay equals 1 minute of movie length. So in one sense, when a screenplay comes to me, I flip through it and see, how many pages is it? Is it between 90 and 110? At the most, 120, because after that people get antsy. So we don't want movies to go too long. 90 to 110 minutes is about right. But then when we actually are reading the screenplay, it's about a hero that we can empathize with for some reason. You know, people who do my job often look to story analysts who've written books. There are people like Sid Field out there who's talked about the 3-act structure. Michael Haig and Christopher Vogler, who are two script gurus. And movies all tend to follow a similar structure, even if they do it in a unique way. So these are all components of what we're looking for in a great screenplay.
In film, what are the essential elements of writing a blockbuster movie?
That's a very good question. You'll find that there's patterns in those films that make them a really good watch, or successful or satisfying to watch. And I think that's got a lot to do with following successful structures. So for example, the 3-act structure is a common structure used in Hollywood films, which essentially gives a framework for your story to follow. Really simple terms, it's like your beginning, your middle and your end. And how that works is that the first act is introducing your characters, the character world, and then giving them a problem or having something happen which they can't get out of too easily. So they have to then go on some kind of journey, whether it's a big adventure or a more internal sort of psychological journey with their own fears sort of thing for the rest of the film. So that's sort of the first act. Usually by the end of the first act, they've reached a turning point where they can't go back. They can't just ignore what's happened, they have to do something. Second act is also called like rising action. So they basically go through a series of events where they try to solve their problem, usually make the situation worse. It makes it more interesting that way. If they're too perfect and they get it right in the first time, it's not very interesting. Yeah. So often they'll make it worse, and it's usually because they're not equipped, so they might have their own character flaws or something that prevents them from making the right decision at the right time. Or they have to learn something, or they, in like mythical journeys, they might have to get a magical object or something like that. By the end of that, they end up getting to a point where they reach the climax. So this starts getting into the third act of the film, which is where things conclude. So everything kind of comes to a head. There's a big climax, all the tension, everything kind of gets to a point. The character does something that ends up resolving the dramatic action. That's sort of the problem that was set up at the start of the film. And then they often return to their home, but they're changed because they've gone through this journey, they've gone through like a character arc.
I always like to think about Shrek, because Shrek had a very visible goal. In the first instance, it was all about saving the princess. So for Shrek, we know whether he's going to succeed or fail because he's either going to actually save Princess Fiona or he's not. So that's what we call the outer journey. The inner journey is something that's happening inside the character. For Shrek, when that movie opens, we see him isolated in his swamp cottage. He doesn't want anyone around. We see signs that say, keep out, stay away. By the end of the movie, he's embraced the fairy tale community and is a person of the community. And there you see an inner journey that goes from him being from an isolated guy, isolated ogre, to a community-oriented ogre, and he saved the princess, in a sense.
So you've got the hobbits, they're in Hobbiton, having a good time. Suddenly Gandalf comes breaking in and is like, oh, have you still got this magic ring? And it turns out this magic ring is a massive problem because it's the weapon of all evil, and very, very bad guys out to find it. So if they don't do something, they're all going to get annihilated. So they have to go on the adventure, and so begins their journey to try to work out how to destroy the ring.
Yeah. Emma, I've heard of a film structure called Hero's Journey. Can you tell me what that means?
There was a book written by a guy called Joseph Campbell, and he had studied a lot of different stories and sort of found out that a lot of the very successful stories followed a main character and followed a particular journey. So it's a bit like the three-act structure, having kind of set points. Hero's Journey is similar, and it actually follows the three-act structure, can follow it quite closely, basically following a particular character through their journey to the end. So it starts off, again, ordinary world, so you have the ordinary character doing whatever he or she does in their world, and then there's a call to adventure. So this is often the problem, this is the first step that they need to take. Usually they don't really want to go on the journey, so there's a bit of a refusal of the call, but eventually something either forces them to do the next step, which is crossing the threshold. Basically that turning point we were talking about in the three-act structure. They get to a point where they have to make a decision, and then there's no going back. They can't just pretend it didn't happen. They have to go on the journey. So then you have trials, and it's sort of a series of events. It's a bit like they keep trying to do things, but doesn't always work out, often makes the situation worse. You have things within that section where, for example, they might find a mentor, so someone who teaches them, or a friend or a guide that kind of helps them a little bit on their journey. So then they get to a point where, basically they get to a point where they can't continue the way they are, and they have to let go of all their past hang-ups, their fears, and they have to transform. So they end up becoming the hero, or becoming what they need to be to finish the quest, exactly. Yeah. And then the last one is basically return to the ordinary world. So usually they complete the quest, they win the princess, they, whatever the story leads them to, and then they often have to go back to the ordinary world, but again they're changed because they've gone through this journey, they've had a character arc, and they've changed, and they come back now as sort of a master of two worlds, really.
So what do you think are some of the most common mistakes people make when they write scripts?
I think it's to overwrite scripts, or it's to confuse the medium. Screenplays and movies are about visuals. It's about seeing the world represented up on screen, where I see a lot of screenplays that are written, and they really should be novels, or they should be short stories. So they tell us rather than show us. So if there's a general note that we sometimes give back, it's that this is a wonderful story, but what you've done is you've told us this story, and that's more appropriate for a great book, or a wonderful novel, or a stage play sometimes. But movies, it's all about the visuals, and that's what we have to be very, very conscious of.
How does script writing differ between short and feature films?
Yes, excellent question. I guess the most obvious difference is time. With a short film, you need to be really concise with how you express a character. Obviously, in a short film, you don't have the time to go into a lot of backstory, to delve into the world of this character, to introduce a lot of different characters. So you might need to simplify everything into one character and their smaller journey, if that makes sense. In short film, you'd probably want to use a lot more sort of time constraint techniques. So, for example, you might use a lot more like a montage or something to kind of express a lot of information in a shorter amount of time. You might use characters that are very identifiable. So rather than a character that's just, say, a
Person.
just a person, you might want to really clearly express who they are. So, for example, if they're going to be a chef, or if that's important to the story, you might go all out with the stereotype of them wearing a chef hat and this sort of thing. It's tricks that you can get the audience to get on board with what story you're trying to tell very, very quickly. Feature film, you have a little bit more time to sort of play with character development, who they are, where they come from, and then how the story develops.
Would you say short films follow the 3-act structure in Hero's Journey?
Good question. They can. Obviously, Hero's Journey 3-act structure does lend itself a little bit better to a feature film because it's a bit longer, so you can sort of really delve into the different steps. But I think trying to fit a 3-act structure into your short film is a really good idea, and they definitely, really successful short films can do that quite well. But again, it's all about expressing yourself very succinctly and using as many mechanisms and clever storytelling techniques to express a lot of information in a short amount of time.
Okay, so if somebody wanted to present an idea to you, would they present the whole script or just their idea?
I'm going to answer this in two ways, because here at Roadshow Films we are a distributor, which means that we don't actually make the movies. The movies are made by producers in Australia. So in Australia, when someone comes in, they not only have the screenplay, they have the person who's going to put that screenplay together. And there are generally 5 elements that we're looking for in terms of a packaged project, we call it, when movies come together. We look to see who the director is, we look to see what the cast is going to be, we look to see who that producer is and what they've done before, we looked at what the budget is, and then of course we looked at the screenplay itself. So it's not just the screenplay we're looking at that entire structure that goes around making the movie. So here screenplay is an essential part of that, and we are looking for a completed screenplay and those other attachments. If, however, we were in Los Angeles and you were going in to pitch to Warner Brothers, for instance, then the studio actually can just put all of those elements around a project that they're interested in, and you could just give them a pitch and they could say, "We love that pitch, go write it." So in LA it tends to work that way with the studios, or screenplay, either or. But here we tend to want to see a screenplay and a producer.
Okay.
I remember at film school, they told me you have 7 minutes, right? So
For a short film?
well, for both really. You have 7 in a short film. If your film is between 5 to 7 minutes of length, I think that's a very, very good time to kind of restrict yourself to, because in general, people will give something about 7 minutes, and if they're not interested, they'll turn it off or they'll walk away. So in a feature film, you want something to happen within that 7 minutes that keeps that person hooked. In a short film, if your film obviously finishes before the 7 minute mark, they'd watch the whole thing, and that's the whole, you've done your job.